Hello, and welcome to the Impact Series Artificial Intelligence event. This is the 7th in a series of events powered by the GSA's Technology Transformation Services, also known as TTS. We're very excited to have so many of you join us today. My name is Georgeta Dragoiu, and I'm a Presidential Innovation Fellow, and I've been supporting our AI portfolio here at TTS. I'm excited to facilitate today's event. While we cover some quick housekeeping notes, please go ahead and introduce yourselves. Tell us your name, organization, and what brought you here today in the chat window below. And before we jump in, a few housekeeping notes. Everyone's automatically muted, so if you have questions, please type them in the chat box, and we'll answer as many as we can in our Q&A sessions. We're recording today's session and we'll post it to the event page along with the other resources you'll see shared here today. A link to live captioning for this event will also be provided in the chat. And please make sure you're abiding by the TTS Code of Conduct throughout our time together. For our media friends with inquiries, please email press@gsa.gov with the topic that you'd like to talk about and your deadline. As you can see from our agenda, we have a number of great stories to share. We hope today will shed some light into how government agencies can leverage artificial intelligence as an enabling technology to meet agency needs. Now, I'll pass things off to my colleague, Steve Babitch, head of the Artificial Intelligence Portfolio at TTS, to kick off today's event.
Super, thanks so much, Georgeta. And hello everyone, and welcome to the TTS Impact Summit Series AI event. We're so glad to have you join us. We've got a great lineup today in which we'll be highlighting the artificial intelligence focus area in TTS. To start, artificial intelligence has brought about transformative change to the way we live, presenting a range of challenges and opportunities. The federal government plays two critical roles with respect to AI as regulator and practitioner. As a regulator, it's important that the government put forth guidance and boundaries on what it means to use AI in a responsible manner and that it aligns with our nation's values. As a practitioner, the government should apply this transformative technology to enhance and support the many ways it serves the people of this country. The range of challenges in implementing AI within the federal government include making sure its wealth of data is ready to be used in an AI context, investing in technical infrastructure to handle the vast amounts of data, and arguably the most important is building out the skills of the government workforce to be AI and data science ready. The government must face these challenges and opportunities head on to stay on the leading edge, sustain a competitive advantage on the global stage, and ensure the long-term prosperity of the United States. Part of doing so includes investing in and applying AI to solve government challenges, whether directly or indirectly impacting the public. And so TTS is partnering with federal agencies across the space to meet these challenges. For more background, last year following the executive order on AI and the White House Summit on AI in Government, TTS established a focus on AI with a mission to help agencies invest in and apply AI to generate better insights and make better decisions, and certainly in a responsible manner, ultimately to help those agencies achieve their mission. Over the last year within TTS, we've had a range of activities in AI focused on helping agencies on their journey to using it. For example, through our Centers of Excellence and Presidential Innovation Fellows, both of which are helping agencies on AI strategy, capability building, and project design, development, and implementation. We also have the US federal government's AI community of practice with nearly 1,000 members strong, as a mechanism to share knowledge, including use cases and best practices. And we're building on all of these efforts by providing products and resources and ways to invest in AI through our broader AI portfolio and 10X, which is a seed fund that is placing a greater emphasis on funding AI-related projects. But today is about the work that is happening across the government focused on AI and automation. And so we're going to hear from agency leaders across the federal government about their experience in building AI and automation systems, specifically from the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Labor. And we'll also discuss some of the critical issues federal agencies face that they're grappling with as they design, develop, and deploy AI systems, specifically around the topic of responsible AI where we'll hear from Alka Patel, the head of AI policy at the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center at the Department of Defense. But our first order of business today, we'd love to hear from you via a Zoom poll. And one quick note about the poll itself. If you cannot see the poll, since you may be viewing from your browser, please put your response to the question here in the chat. And our first question is, how would you rate your understanding of responsible AI? Is it my coffee cup knows more than I do? I know more than my coffee cup. I'm middle of the road, enough to be dangerous, of course dangerous in a responsible way. I actively participate in or lead responsible AI discussions in my organization, or I am the Albert Einstein of responsible AI. All right, we'll let people populate the poll. We've got we've got some reasonably intelligent coffee cups out there, but in the lead is a bit of middle of the road and knowing more than your coffee cup. So let's see how things continue to shake out. All right, middle of the road. It's catching up, not doing too well. We've got an Albert Einstein in the group, so that's fantastic. We will certainly put you on the stage if we have time in our summit today. All right. Looks like folks are sort of in the middle. Good. All right. Super. Well, thanks so much everyone for joining and responding to our first poll question. Our first session is focused on covering responsible AI, so hopefully that will start to bolster your knowledge on this important topic. And so to get things started in earnest, we'll now hear from our keynote speaker, Dan Morgan, who was kind enough to record his remarks today for the summit. Dan Morgan is the Assistant Chief Information Officer and Chief Data Officer at the Department of Transportation. He is responsible for improving data quality, data sharing, and new data product development in the department. And as CDO, he is also in charge of the department's data program and compliance. Dan will provide us with his perspective on what it takes to push forward on adopting AI technologies and systems in government. Dan, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Dan Morgan, and I'm the Chief Data Officer at the U.S. Department of Transportation, and it's my honor to join you for today's Technology Transformation Services AI Summit. I want to thank Steve and the Technology Transformation Services team for inviting me to share some thoughts about AI in government and AI specifically at the U.S. Department of Transportation. You know, I think we are at an interesting point in the transportation world. I would dare say it's actually one of the more exciting times to be in the world of transportation. The digital revolution is bringing new and exciting capabilities to the transportation sector, and those capabilities are bringing an ever-increasing amount of data to be used in decision making. As we think about how we're taking steps as an agency to harness the power of that data and understand how we can use it to advance our national transportation goals, we're also thinking about how the digital revolution is impacting the sector that we regulate and how we understand how the sector is using artificial intelligence in their technologies today. We take an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how we want to approach the AI question as an agency. So we've formed a machine learning and artificial intelligence steering committee that consists of views from our policy organization, our research organization, our IT organization, and from me as part of our data organization. And together, we're trying to drive a unified path forward for the agency to be able to harness this technology. And I think, you know, we find ourselves still early in our AI journey. And I've been trying to think about sort of how we sort of get off of top dead center and get moving in the deployment of what is potentially one of the more transformational technologies of our time, right? So I think about sort of two scales when I start to work through what the agency's considerations are. One is sort of the product scale. Is AI part of a human-machine interface that you can use to voice enable some of your existing applications, let's say? Are AI techniques part of what you can do to enhance the results of a search and make your application more useful to an end user, you should probably deploy those things right away, right? Because being able to use that kind of AI in that kind of sort of slice of a larger product is just a modern way to develop applications. And guidance and technology considerations for those kinds of approaches kind of already exists, and that means you can get started. Another sort of next level of impact for us is as part of a larger process. So maybe we don't have an AI product running inside the agency, but we want to use AI techniques to process a bunch of data, to maybe label a bunch of data or something like that. And so what we need to do is offline in an overall workflow, put a little bit of AI on it, to use a little bit of a metaphor, so that we could go ahead and move it forward. And so that's, I think, another sort of self-contained apparatus that allows us to learn and then be able to scale out our AI applications. And then ultimately, what we want to be able to do is get to a place where we're delivering AI products. And I don't think we're there yet as an agency. I don't think anybody really is fully in an AI product space. But this is where the questions start to get really sticky and harder to answer. They're the same questions we would ask about any technology, but they're harder to answer because of the technologies that we're using. We can de-risk another way in terms of user impact. And you can think about this from the algorithmic assessment, impact assessment point of view, right? So some user impacts is just delivering information that's relevant and potentially timely to that end user. You can introduce some kinds of questions about what you're surfacing to folks, and you should monitor those kinds of things, but making sure that the AI performs as intended is a thing you would do anyway if it was just any other kind of search engine. As we start to get into the decision space, and as a regulator, this is extremely important to me, as we get into the decision space, we want to make sure that we can give a reason for why we made a decision. The computer said so is not a reason, and we need to be able to explain the impact of how AI and computers may have influenced the agency's decision to permit or deny an application or to avail somebody of their benefits. I think the important message that I have today is you can get started. You don't have to be bogged down in these weighty questions that we're going to go through later today about ethics and responsibility and bias. They matter, but some of them are well solved depending on the use case and the size that you're going through. AI is a part of what you do already as a technologist today. What we need to be able to do is scale that out and learn in chunks along the way so that we can be successful. So I wish you a very successful summit. I know that you're going to hear from some very smart people, and hopefully you'll be able to take next steps back at your own agencies to move your AI programs forward. Thanks.
Great, thanks to Dan for sharing his thoughts on harnessing AI for transforming our transportation system. Now I'd like to introduce—
Good afternoon.
Now I'd like to introduce our Fireside chat session focused on the responsible and ethical use of AI. I think Dan was reminding us that that's our next topic. And pass things over to Kathy McNeill, who's going to lead our discussion with our next speaker. Kathy is Artificial Intelligence Director at the Centers of Excellence at TTS. Kathy?
Thanks so much, Georgeta. We'd like to welcome Alka Patel. Alka Patel serves as the head of AI ethics policy for the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, or the JAIC, at the Department of Defense. In this role, she leads the efforts on responsible AI, bringing 20 years of experience working at the intersection of technology, business, and law. Alka, welcome. As federal government agencies grapple with ethics of AI, we're eager to hear about the work that you are leading, the lessons learned, and how government can ensure responsible use of AI. So as a first question, as the head of ethics policy at the JAIC, why does your role exist, and what do you do in your role?
Great, thanks for the question, Kathy. And I want to just start by saying hello to you. Nice to see you, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today. I have to say, love the poll. definitely want to talk to the Albert Einstein because I could probably use some tips. I don't have a coffee mug, so I don't know what that says about me and being effective and working on this topic. But really, really excited to be here and love sort of the enthusiasm that I'm seeing in the chat and the variety of individuals, sectors, disciplines represented. So to answer your question though, I would say in terms of my role, and I'll give a bit of a brief background, I would say probably in the last 2 or 3 years, and I'm sure many of you are observing the same, if we take a look at private industry, you've seen sort of the advent of these types of roles in AI ethics, leading responsible AI, predominantly started probably by the tech companies where these roles were sort of precipitated. And I think there's an appreciation, or at that time there was an appreciation and an acknowledgement that AI brings some unique aspects to bear, right? So the fact that the non-deterministic, the non-static aspects, the fact that the power and the speed by which this technology is advancing between the compute power and the data access and availability, all of this is sort of converging all at around the same time. And so the need to really be thoughtful and have resources dedicated, teams dedicated to thinking about these issues really came to the forefront in the last couple of years. In regards to my role specifically, I will say that I can't have the discussion about my role without acknowledging General Shanahan, who's the first director of the JAIC, who had the foresight and the vision, and frankly, it was senior leadership in addition to General Shanahan, who really had that foresight to think about instituting or creating this type of a role and position at the JAIC and at the DoD. And I think it only just makes sense given the DoD, given its culture around ethics, its history, its longstanding history, its existing ethical and legal frameworks. And so I think it was just sort of the right time, the right place where he was of the mindset that this was a necessary step for the organization or the agency. Specifically in terms of my day-to-day role and my activities. So many of you may or may not know, but in February, the DoD did adopt AI ethics principles. And so my role was to come in and determine how do we actually put those principles into practice? How do we implement them into practices, processes, policies, take those higher level words and definitions and actually make them tactical. And I will say, and I think you've already alluded to this, Kathy, I am not coming at this from the lens, or my background is not in the traditional training of philosophy or ethics. My background really is in engineering and law. And so I come at this from the technical lens as well as this sort of legal, risk management, governance, corporate governance, compliance perspective to the conversation. And so really trying to think through how do we take those principles and make them into pragmatic, practical practices and processes.
That's great. Thank you, Alka. I think that's really interesting. You know, when we think about AI and ethics, and you've set up a series of ethics principles, maybe let's set some groundwork for the audiences. What is responsible AI? I mean, some people are talking about coffee cups, some people are have a moderate understanding, but how do you view that? What is your lens when you think about AI responsibility?
Sure. Now, that's a great question. And I think it's such an important question, regardless of the conversation, because many times we are all saying the right words and we all sort of have that context in our mind, right? And so I really appreciate that question because I think that will sort of level set for the rest of the conversation. So, and if I take a step back, I'm going to take sort of a micro view and a macro view. So the micro view is looking at these DoD AI ethics principles, right? There's 5 of them: responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. Many of those principles are instantiated through good engineering practices. And so we're looking at the entire AI product lifecycle. So we're looking at design, develop, deploy, and use. And we're looking at these 5 principles and trying to determine how best to identify and have those defined standard engineering practices. But really, what we need to be doing is also to be able to actually implement those principles is also to take a step back and kind of go to that macro view of figuring out what does that infrastructure need to be to actually put those practices into play. And so what does the organizational infrastructure, the enterprise infrastructure need to look like? We're not just talking about the technology when we say responsible AI, we're talking about the organizational culture, we're talking about operating structures within the organization, and so that whole infrastructure framework in which to actually be able to put things into practice. At the DoD, as we go down this journey of actually implementing and thinking about that broader concept of responsible AI, we've been thinking about it in 4 pillars. So people, processes, partnerships, and policy. And so thinking about from the people lens, recognizing, and this is to Dan's point, the concept of the need for interdisciplinary voices and expertise at the table. And so thinking about how do we include and bring those additional subject matter expertise and those voices to the table as we're going through the design, develop, and use the product lifecycle, frankly. What are the roles and responsibilities? How are we training and educating our workforce to really have a level of responsible AI literacy and have sort of that common language, shared language? When we talk about processes, thinking about tools and frameworks and thinking about governance structures, thinking about all of those separate pieces that are necessary to provide some of the escalation paths, for example, allow for the oversight and allow for that infrastructure to be built out. Partnerships, thinking through how do we work with our acquisition partners, right? And so if we're talking about practices that we are implementing within the DoD, how do we ensure that there's fidelity when we're working with our acquisition partners in terms of their practices and processes around responsible AI, or even how they define responsible AI, right? And even on the allies perspective, when we think about it from an international lens. And then of course, using policy as a vehicle, or one vehicle, I should say, to bring all of that together so that we are working in a centralized fashion. We've got that centralized alignment at the organizational level while allowing for decentralized autonomy for the various components or services within the organizations so that they can implement as necessary based on their own unique resources, structures, and practices. So that's sort of a broad framework, but the point being is that it's really a combination of the tech, the operating structures, and the organizational culture, and there's a number of different parts within an organization. So again, not just the technology piece, but also thinking about the human capital aspect, thinking about the acquisition and procurement aspects, thinking about collaborative partnerships with industry and academia as well. And so there's a whole host of pieces that get connected under that umbrella of responsible AI.
Now, I think that gives us a really nice framework with which to work. And I think, Alka, what's really nice about how you describe that is it's very practical, and it really lives within the technology practices that a lot of people use today. And I think, Dan referenced that AI ethics can be extremely weighty. On the other hand, if we continue on the way we are, it can be less weighty. So in your experience, what's gone wrong with AI?
Sure.
Why should we care about the ethics, basically?
Sure, and I'll give some examples, which I'm sure many of the audience has heard of, but I'll just sort of highlight some of the big ones. And I do want to, Kathy, to your point though, and actually I did catch that when Dan was saying, ethics can be weighty. I would counter that and say that ethics is an enabler, right? So if we are doing AI and we're doing AI right, ethics is an enabler, not an inhibitor. And so we have to come at it from that perspective. And the fact, so I think I just wanted to sort of come back and circle back on that point. In terms of some examples, I think, there's so many common ones, and I think as each day goes by, there's a new one that's popping up in the news in terms of algorithms gone bad. I don't know. Maybe that should be a show. I don't know. I hope not, actually.
Yeah, there you go.
Right. But so, for example, hiring algorithms, right? For a circumstance where these algorithms are using data that has sort of embedded biases, historical biases embedded within them, and if they're used without the necessary sort of guardrails and checkpoints and assessments to assure that all those biases have been removed. If you continue to use these biased data sets, you're just perpetuating the historical negative consequences and sort of the systemic issues as time has gone on. And so thinking about, you know, the data, for example, in one set of algorithms. Another example is, I don't know if you're familiar with the one that's quite commonly shown with the stop signs, sort of the adversarial attack one, where a stop sign, some researchers, there's actually an experiment where they put this reflective tape on stop signs, and the autonomous vehicles, once the tape was on those stop signs, did not recognize it as a stop sign. They recognized it as a speed limit. And that could have significant consequences, right? We're talking about life or death. And so, you know, trying to be able to identify every single potential consequence or every potential outcome in every single potential context is really hard to do. And so I think that is one of the challenges with a number of these types of applications that, you know, requires us to be very diligent as we think about new data sets being introduced while in use and potentially causing model drift, where the performance of the algorithm, which was expected, is no longer performing it the way that it needs to be.
Yeah, you know, I think that's a really good point. And I want to come back to, I think ethics and AI responsibility, or responsible AI, can be an enabler. I think that's a really important point for us to kind of be thinking about. What advice would you give agencies as they are thinking about their strategy, implementation, and the responsible use of AI? How would you help them think about that?
Sure. So I'm going to actually echo something Dan said as well. My first piece of advice is start now. I know that it might be, for those who haven't, right? I know it might be overwhelming. I know it might be daunting, but you do have to start somewhere. And if your agency already has an AI strategy, then there should be consideration of making sure that responsible AI or AI ethics is addressed and addressed within that AI strategy. That then becomes sort of your North Star and your guiding document as you work through implementing the strategy across the organization. I will say too, real briefly, that just to level set, the principles that I talked about being adopted in February, they didn't happen overnight. That was 2 years of work, actually, and there were a number of different entities and pieces that came together. So again, set expectations in terms of like, this will take time, but you guys start somewhere. The second piece is increasing awareness around why responsible AI is important and necessary. So those examples that I just kind of alluded to, many people may or may not be thinking about those and or understand or appreciate the context of that. And so how can we increase the training and education and awareness around responsible AI literacy? It's sort of that crawl, walk, run. We can't necessarily get to that last desired end state without doing the work at the beginning. And then I would say also do it in a collaborative fashion. So I know Steve and Krista are leading the AI ethics working group as part of the broader AI community of practice. And so I think those kind of communities where you can share out, bounce ideas off of each other are really important and critical for knowledge sharing, for creation of tools, for thinking through processes. And so I think that collaborative aspect is really, really important too. As well. So I think perhaps those might be some things to consider as entities or organizations are trying to think through how they get started.
And I think that's really important and wise advice to give us too, because sometimes I think we think we have to be perfect at this, or we have to get it done all right now, and it's just that isn't how it's going to work, right?
That's, you know, I actually, one of the points I was going to also make earlier too, is like, you kind of have to have the mindset that things are going to fail, right? Things are going to fail. So your job is to be proactive. You got to be focused on being proactive, but plan to be reactive. So expecting sort of the worst and finding ways to mitigate against that throughout the entire process and infrastructure. And that way, when you do need to be reactive, you've got mechanisms and ways to actually engage and address those types of issues.
That's great. Thanks, Alka. I think we've all enjoyed those comments that you've made. I'd like to now move to the question and answer section. of the conversation in the Fireside chat. So if people have questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. It looks like there's been a few questions posted. So we'll give everybody a chance to catch up a little bit and look for the first question. So while we're collecting the questions, so here's the first question I'd like to ask. How did you work with leadership to make sure they invested in responsible AI?
It's a great question. First of all, I will say I don't know that that work is ever done, right? Like that is a continuing conversation, right? So, but I think again, given the DoD's culture and focus on ethics, safety, especially for complex engineering systems, I think it was sort of an easy transition and understanding within the agency of why this is important, why it's critical. I do believe, though, to actually effectively implement within an organization, you do need resources. And so having those continual conversations and making the case and providing examples are really critical to sort of making the case for why financial resources, why subject matter expertise resources are necessary. So for example, I go back to that collaboration aspect. We don't have all the necessary subject matter expertise, right? I think that's really hard for organizations, especially perhaps in government. And so collaborating and partnering with academia where you can leverage those and being creative and thinking about different ways to pull those kind of resources together to make this happen is really important. And so a lot of, while I talk about financial aspects, I think there's also creative ways to engage leadership to see the value. And frankly, it's not just the value as it relates to responsible AI. It's actually a value proposition across the entire conversation around advancing an AI strategy within any agency, frankly.
Yep, and it goes back to, I think, one of your pillars, the partnership within your technology team and across the agency. So one of the questions we have from the audience, which is a testament to your expertise, is, are you available to help guide departments towards what to consider when implementing programs that incorporate AI technologies?
Well, I'm flattered by that question. I'm always open to talking with any of the areas, and I know I've done that through Krista and Steve as well. So I'm happy to make myself available. I will share too. One thing that I've also learned is that there is no one size fits all. So I'm really mindful of the fact that the approaches would need to be very, while there's some baseline aspects of the approach, there's going to be nuances that are specific to, again, resources and operational structures, because a lot of this is about how do you embed into existing workflows, for example, so you can minimize the barriers to adoption around the AI ethics aspects. And then there's going to be some aspects where you do need to sort of create from scratch as well. So a lot of sort of moving parts, but to the extent that I can help, I'm willing and more than.
That's great, thank you. We have another question. Many of us rely on contractors to build and implement and possibly run our AI systems. How do we put responsible AI clauses in contracts to make sure we are taking these issues into account? This is a tough question, I think.
And Kathy, I'm sure this is one that's close to your heart too. I know with this is a million-dollar question, right? So I think it's one that we're also talking about as well at this end. There's so many different aspects to this, and me with my lawyer hat, I've had folks just say, well, just put a clause in there that the contractor is going to comply with the DoD AI ethics principles, and I was like, I think that may work from a signaling mechanism so that contractors are even aware that we have principles, but that's not going to be effective in actually getting the objectives that we're trying to get to. And so as we think about practices and processes, so I'll take data cards and model cards, for example. Can we put in the contract that, for example, you contractor are going to use data cards and model cards. You're going to be transparent about how you review those data cards and model cards, and or you're going to allow us to come in and audit, or you're going to do the review and assessments with us together. So I think there, those are the types of, or that's the level of language and contracts that we need to get to. So sort of another step down from the principles themselves and really get to the actual practices and processes that either require certain tools, require certain assessments, require certain reporting requirements, audit requirements. It almost reminds me of my banking days. You know, when you're thinking about SSA 16 reports and you know, the SOC 2 reports, like what is that vehicle that we can contractually require the acquisition partners to abide to? I will say though too, I'm very sensitive to quote unquote dictating what those requirements need to be done, what they need to be done from an agency perspective. I think that's a conversation that needs to happen mutually with our contractors, or at least have some insight, because I think from a resource perspective for these organizations, their business models, just being sort of, again, cognizant of the fact that there are already standing processes and we need to be not so prescriptive, but we need to be flexible, but still have the fidelity of the content and criteria we are expecting from the contractors themselves. So yeah, we could talk about that for a long time.
I know it's a complex issue, and it requires a lot of balance, right? And there's a lot of variableness in the types of solutions being presented. So I understand the difficulties of that. One final question for you, okay, as we close out this great session is, as AI continues to evolve and be adopted, do you think the rules around responsible AI will need to change and evolve as well?
So I'm going to focus on the word rules, right? So I'm going to say, if we're talking about the DoD AI ethics principles, the principles that have been adopted, I don't believe the principles would ever change, right? I think those are the principles that is our North Star for the agency. What could change, and I do expect to change, frankly, because this area is still nascent and there's still a lot of research that is occurring in best practices around, for example, test and evaluation. And so we don't even know necessarily all the answers when it comes to T&E. So I do expect practices and processes evolving as time goes on, and as the research community and industry with their commercial tools and so forth, as those advance, I definitely do see practices and processes changing, but our principles will remain steadfast as our North Star.
I think that makes sense. And I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us and talk with the audience. I think everybody found it as interesting as I did. So with that, I think we'll shift back to Georgeta and give her back the comm, so to speak.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Alka.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Alka and Kathy, for giving us so much to think about. Really love the ethics as an enabler and reminding us of that and walking us through a framework for responsible AI. Moving on to our next session, I'm excited to introduce some of my PIF colleagues at the VA, focusing on the application of natural language processing to tackle the challenges of benefits delivery. It's my pleasure to introduce Nelson Colon, a fellow PIF who led the development of the first machine learning API at the VA. Nelson, take it away.
Thank you, Jessa. Hi all, my name is Nelson Colon. I'm here with Zach Goldfein, the Deputy CTO for the benefits portfolio at the VA. Zach and I worked for the past 2 years on improving the benefits delivery using machine learning. And so we're going to have a conversation about our work. But before we dive into the work, I would like to give the floor to Zach so that he can properly introduce himself.
Thanks, Mel and Georgeta and everyone involved. Nice to meet y'all. I'm Zach, as Mel mentioned. I'm the Deputy CTO at VA for benefits delivery. So any project that leverages technology to get veterans, more benefits more quickly, more easily, and provide a better experience while doing so, I'm quite interested in.
So Zach, I think the first question is, tell us about the problem that we're that we were trying to solve by using machine learning. And by the way, Zach is my go-to person at the VA for definitions and knowledge. So I fully, it's my fault that, you know, like I'm bestowing this question on him because he's going to do a much better job at explaining it than I am.
I'll do my best. So veterans earn benefits from their service in the military. And in order to get those benefits, they submit applications to VA, and we call those applications claims. One of those benefits is monthly payments if you were injured in your service. So one example is if you have ringing in your ears as a result of your service, that's something that the VA would make a monthly payment in order to compensate for that injury. And so we have over 1 million veterans every year applying for these benefits related to injuries that they suffered in service. Keep in mind, these injuries can be physical or psychological. And when these veterans submit these claims, in other words, when they apply for these benefits, on average, it takes them 100 days, or excuse me, they wait 100 days before hearing back from VA whether or not they'll receive the benefits that they've earned, which is insane. It's over 3 months, and it's sort of unconscionable given how quickly and capably veterans were able to do incredibly complex things while serving in the military. The vast majority of these claims that veterans are submitting are coming via mail or fax. And we have 2 stages of people that have to pay attention to and do work on these claims before the information is in the appropriate system for us to make a decision on that claim. And so the first group of people are looking at these mailed and faxed claims, and they're manually typing data from the claim into a computer system. And then the second group of people is taking that information from a computer system and they're translating it into language, essentially, that VA understands in order for us to make a decision on that claim. To give an example of what I mean by that translation, a veteran can write however they think about the injury they suffered. So they might say, my ear hurts and there's a ringing noise constantly. That's what appears in the claim that comes to us. But VA doesn't give a bit for my ear hurts and I have ringing constantly. It gives a benefit or gives a monthly payment for hearing loss. So the problem was that veterans were facing an extra 5-day delay in getting the decision on their benefits because there was this backup of claims at that portion of the process where it required a person to make that translation from my ear hurts and I have ringing noise to hearing loss so that VA could then process the claim. The only times that VA would be able to automate, to use computers essentially to move those claims forward in the process is when somebody wrote the exact phrase that VA understands. So only if somebody wrote exactly the words hearing loss would that allow us to move the claim forward in an automatic way. And as you can imagine, less than 2% of claims had somebody writing that exact phrase in the way that would allow us to speed up the claims processing. So I feel like that's a good maybe transition point to you, Nell. So you were presented with this problem, and can you share with folks here what solution you came up with?
Yeah. So as Zach mentioned, when we looked at the process, we realized that there was this huge bottleneck where the claims were coming in, but the system did not recognize the language that the veteran was writing. And so it would off-ramp that to a human. And because it seemed like such a data-rich portion of the pipeline, right? It seemed like it would be a good place for machine learning. But the thing was that there was already a process in place. There was a huge system that is moving millions of claims per year, right? So it was not as easy as just shutting it down and building something new. So we needed to build something that could be sort of plug and play. And so we came up with this idea of, why don't we build the machine learning portion, the model, and then we just wrap it on an API. And so that way we can just give it as an option to the current system. So if the system says, ring it in my ears, I don't know what that is, then try this claims attributes API. And then the claims attributes API might say, oh, you know, I think that is, I'm 96% confident that that is hearing loss, so proceed with the claim with hearing loss. And so essentially we wanted to build something that could be done by just adding something to the process without having to reinvent the process. And so that's how we came up with a solution using machine learning and building an API around it. And so, so Zach, can you tell us then, you know, what were the effects that we saw after deployment? What were some of the numbers of the impact that this had?
Yeah, it was one of those rare cases, at least in my experience in government, where you see such a clear cause and effect. Basically overnight, as soon as Nell and his colleagues' model was implemented and deployed, we saw almost triple the number of successful cases where we were able to move those claims forward in the process automatically rather than wait for that second phase of people to translate. And so we ended up seeing tens of thousands of veterans every month getting their benefits decisions about 5 days more quickly. So waiting 5 days fewer for that decision, and saving the VA millions of dollars in the process, enabling people who were normally making that translation manually to work on different parts of the process, reduce the backlog in claims that VA has had for a long time, and focus on other areas that we could improve for the veterans' experience along the way.
And one really interesting thing that we saw right away that I absolutely love, I wish we had the graph, but immediately there was I think it was almost 3x jump in the amount of claims that were auto-established from July till August, which was the next month after deployment. And that was a really significant impact and validation to the work that we were doing.
Yeah. And one thing I think about and wonder about Nell is, like, you know, there have been techniques for classifying information or doing regression analyses for a long time. You know, there are statistical methods that have existed for a while. So curious what it was about this problem that you thought was uniquely suited to some of the more modern data science techniques that are part of the world of machine learning.
Yeah, I think it was, so for the people that are data nerds like myself, this was a really interesting problem, because when you think about the information that we were getting, since these claims were all related to specific types of benefits, and the actual fields to write in text are very limited, we actually had surprisingly fewer words in our dictionary, but we had an immense amount of records. So we had the opposite problem of the data science industry, where we actually have really dense, rich data to build a model. And so that was the first thing that to me signaled, we can not only do this, but we can actually build a really good solution. And so, but I also want to point out that I think trust is really important, and the models, like regression models, are really easy to explain. And so the first iteration, we actually built with a logistic regression so that we could essentially go back to the business owners and explain why each decision was happening. So there was some part of it that was leveraging the more statistical, well-known models, but then also once we proved that we could do it, then we built something more more complex using more current techniques. So I think it's now time for the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And I think one question, as questions come in, Zach, that I have for you is that you're now continuing this work and you have built a really amazing team at the VA. And so I know there's agencies out there looking to build similar things. And so they don't have a team in place. And so can you give them a pointer on what's of your team composition? Do you have a lot of data people? Do you have a lot of designers? What's that magical formula that you have? What's that blend that you have?
I think it's really important to have a multidisciplinary team. I think one thing that was unique in our situation is frankly just you, Nell, and your expertise and skill set. But I think what you probably found, or what we've talked about that you found while working at VA, is that it's you need people around you for support, for enablement, for empowerment, for disentangling certain complexities that are around the work, for explaining the work, selling the work. There's just a lot of the modeling portion of that project, if I remember correctly, only took about a couple of weeks, maybe 4 weeks at the most. But there's efforts ongoing, a year plus now, that relate to the project, and that's because it's useful to have designers and user researchers who are understanding the implication, like the human impacts of the work, the inputs and the outputs from a human level. System designers who can map out what are the different components of the system that we're interacting with and how will they be affected by that intervention. Product managers who can understand the product from a holistic perspective and understand resourcing needs and road mapping and dependencies and how to prioritize different parts of the work, what should be included, what should be excluded. Software engineers who can wrap a model like that in an API and make it available to programmers, external and internal, who want to use it. There's really a need for a multidisciplinary team to enable the type of work that I think Nell is describing. I think one piece that's sometimes missing from government projects are some of those more modern product development and technical roles, like product manager, user researcher, designer, software engineer, data scientist. But I think one thing that people from that world miss coming to government and trying to do this work is the need for policy expertise and an understanding of the way that the organization works and relationships among different components of the organization. And so we were really lucky to have a couple of really strong partners at the VA who have been there for 10 years or longer, who understood the dynamics, the politics, the organizational considerations for creating something like this that would have such a big impact and helping us navigate what needed to be navigated, understand the constraints, what was actually a constraint, what was just an obstacle in order to implement something like this. And then I saw one question, if I could just jump in and answer, because it's something that I always thought about, which is how do you address, this is from Stacy, how do you address staff concern that the AI solution wouldn't result in their being replaced and they're losing their jobs? And that's something that seems to always come up when automation is discussed and sometimes when AI is discussed in general. And I think the simple answer is like, you talk with the staff, you understand their concerns. I saw a couple of people on here from VA in the Minneapolis office, which is one of the regional offices I visited among a few across the US when we were doing some of this work. And I think what I found in those conversations is something that will hopefully resonate with most people here, is like, we all have parts of our job that we don't like. Whether that be like a million emails we need to respond to, or entering like certain data elements when we need to like take leave. There are always monotonous parts of our jobs, no matter what our job is. And I would guess that most of us wish that we could automate those away when and where possible. This is one of those things that people just didn't like to do. It was manual data reentry in a scenario where many of them are veterans themselves. They'd rather be spending their time doing things you'd think they'd rather be spending their time doing, like talking with veterans on the phone, understanding what's going on, getting them information they need, helping them resolve more complex problems. And so, yeah, I think this was a concern from a lot of the folks on the management side, but ended up not being really much of a thing when speaking with the actual staff. There was just a sort of a shared or common understanding that that this is something that humans don't need to put their time and attention to in the VA, in this VA instance, because the folks who were being asked to do that, this was the part of their job that they didn't like, and they wanted to be spending time doing other stuff. So sorry to jump in, but it's something that I think about quite a bit.
No, yeah, that's a really good question. So one final question that we also have that we would like to ask is, and I think this is something that it's ongoing for your team because you keep iterating on this build. So how do you continue to evaluate the performance of the Claims Attributes API? And yeah, how do you make sure that it's performing well, and how do you make sure that when do you know when to update it, for example, and what sort of metrics are you looking at in terms of making those kind of decisions?
Yeah, so our North Star metric on this one is getting veterans benefits more quickly, or at least that decision more quickly. So we want to keep an eye on how long is it taking on average for veterans who are submitting these claims or these applications for benefits to actually get that decision. And so when we can monitor the course of the claims processing for each of those submitted applications, that we can determine, is there still a snag at that point in the process where people need to where a claim needs translation from what the veteran wrote down to what the VA understands. And then we are now evolving this model to include a sort of assistance in the next portion of the process, which is once we understand as an organization what this claim is, it's a hearing loss claim, then how do we route it to the right person who can then take it and understand it on a deeper level and make a decision about it. And so that involves what we call attributes. There's a couple of technical terms at VA for it, but really it's just which claims, which applications deserve a flag, a special attention of some sort, so that we can route it to a person who specializes to handle that type of case. One example would be if a veteran's experiencing homelessness. That's a claim that we want to pay attention to right away. We want to prioritize it so that we can make sure that we give assistance as quickly as possible, because this is a person in a risky scenario or situation. And so we want to be able to, if somebody writes, I have pain in my, my ear hurts, I have ringing in my ear, and I'm sleeping on the street or something like that, which we'll see in claims that come through, somebody writing something like that. Well, then we can use this expanded version of the model to determine this person's experiencing homelessness, and we should prioritize it. So I know that partly answers your question, but I think the part that I didn't answer is maybe subconsciously because we don't have a good answer, when to update it. So this is basically a statically trained model. And I think one open question in the government side of AI implementation is, how do we build sort of this like robust capability of retraining the model over time, updating it over time with data based on our interventions and just sort of new, how the environment can shift over time, and we need to be able to sense that. And I don't know that we have a good answer. We've been lucky enough to have someone like Nell. We brought in another Presidential Innovation Fellow, Babatunde, who's kind of taking the mantle from Nell and can help us at an individual level make decisions like that. But we haven't systematized it, and that's, I think, a big open question, something we'll need to figure out.
Well, Zach, that's all the time that we have, but I want to thank you for taking the time to chat with us, and I look forward to hearing more about the Claims Attributes API as it progresses. Georgeta, back to you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Zach and Nell. Your work at the VA clearly demonstrates the real life impact that AI technologies, in this case, natural language processing, can have, not only on agency missions, but also on our veterans' lives. So thank you for sharing that inspiring work with us. Before we begin our next session with the Department of Labor, we'd like to ask our second poll question, so get ready. And a quick note about the poll: if you can't see it, since some of you may be viewing from your browser, please put your response to the questions in the chat. And I'll also go ahead and read the poll questions. What is the greatest challenge you see when it comes to AI adoption? One, oh, people are so quick to respond. One, knowing where and how to begin. Training and skill development, funding and or executive buy-in, how to buy AI, acquisition, and the last, data readiness and tech infrastructure maturity. So lots of answers coming in. We didn't get any coffee mugs in our poll, but lots of exciting participation here. And I think we're seeing that the last, data readiness and tech infrastructure maturity, is at 44%, with a close second for training and skill development, which Zach and Nell touched briefly on, thinking about that recipe for the right team members. So thank you so much for everyone who participated. With that, I would like to introduce our next session, led by Krista Kennard, one of our directors at the AI Center of Excellence, who's going to introduce our next speakers to talk about automation and the road to AI. Krista?
Thank you so much, Georgeta. It's really great to be here. And today I'm actually joined by two leaders from the Department of Labor. We have the Deputy CIO of the Department of Labor, Lou Charlier. He couldn't be here today in person, but he has shared a recording with us. Ryan has really been instrumental in the development of the automations that we've done here at DOL, and specifically about thinking about this technology in the procurement space. So Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Krista. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon, and thanks to TTS for the invitation. As Krista mentioned, my name is Ryan Chandler, and I lead the Office of Strategy and Administration within the Office of the Senior Procurement Executive of the Department of Labor. As a recent addition to the DOL team, I was incredibly excited by the department's plan to leverage robotic process automation to streamline some of our procurement operations. A perennial challenge in the acquisition field involves navigating an ever-complex regulatory and commercial landscape in a resource-constrained environment. As federal business advisors, our acquisition workforce is motivated, highly skilled, and extraordinarily well-trained. But the nature of operational procurement necessitates the completion of a number of tasks that don't require a contract specialist or contracting officer to utilize their keen business sense or call on this extensive training. Sometimes procurement work requires the completion of mundane, rote tasks before our procurement professionals can dig into the complexities of negotiation or source selection. That's just the nature of the work. We viewed these types of tasks as ripe for robotic process automation implementation. In keeping with the President's management agenda and the cross-agency priority goal to shift our workforce from so-called low-value to high-value work, that is, moving our time, energy, and resources spent performing repetitive manual processes over to focus on complex and challenging tasks for which they're uniquely suited to complete. It was with all of this in mind that we at DOL's Office of the Senior Procurement Executive identified 3 processes we thought would be a good fit to pilot RPA at the department: contractor responsibility determination, market research, and letter of intent generation were all seen as areas where leveraging RPA could help us shift staff resources to where they're most critically needed for the hard problems. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all 3 today, but we'll instead focus on just one: our contractor responsibility bot. Before we get into the specifics of the bot, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the business problem. What is contractor responsibility? How and why do contracting officers make a determination of contractor responsibility? Well, the Federal Acquisition Regulation requires purchases made from and contracts awarded to only responsible prospective contractors. And responsible contractors must demonstrate adequate financial resources, have a satisfactory performance record, demonstrate the necessary experience and business standing to perform the work. FAR requires the contracting officer to make an affirmative determination of this responsibility prior to making any award. And to do this, our COs collect data from a number of different sources. When we looked at it, we estimated that in an average year, we performed this task about 2,000 times, with each determination requiring about 1 to 2 hours to complete. And now these are 2,000 hours spent on highly repetitive manual processes, and these are hours that are unavailable for other more complex tasks. Additionally, we saw automation as a path to greater consistency and risk reduction as we standardize this process across our organization. We knew RPA could help us in aggregating and documenting the necessary information in order for contracting officers to make their determination. OSPE had the procurement know-how, but these technologies are new for us, and we needed some help getting our ideas off the ground. To that end, we partnered with GSA's Centers of Excellence to help us manage the development of our bots. Together with GSA, we worked with a contractor for the actual development. Our deputy CIO, Lou Charlier, will talk about that a little bit more after, talk about our partnership, but I wanted to give you an idea about what that development effort looked like. We worked with GSA and the contractor to map out our existing business processes and devise the best path forward to leverage RPA for these efforts. With all of the bots, and the contractor responsibility bot specifically, we attempted to flatten the learning curve for our user base by utilizing familiar technologies such as email and Excel. And to that end, the user interface for these bots is as simple as filling out an Excel template, attaching it to an email, and sending it off to a designated email address. The template's intuitive and easy to understand, and users complete a handful of required fields before attaching and emailing it to the bot. And this is where the magic happens. What previously took an hour or two of active time from our users is now completed passively by the bot in about 3 minutes. The bot goes out and pulls data from Dun & Bradstreet, beta.sam.gov, and FAPUS. It then takes the information pulled from these sources and uses it to fill out some of the required paperwork and provide screenshots from some of these systems for an easy review by the contracting officer. After the initial work with the development team, I can't tell you how exciting it was to watch the bot for the first time, doing the work that previously took our staff hours in a matter of minutes. It was pretty incredible. For those of you that have already dipped your toe into RPA, I'm sure that you can relate to that sort of eureka moment. Suddenly we saw the far-reaching potential of these technologies. And this isn't a substitute for human judgment, but RPA has the potential to be a powerful force multiplier at DOL. There are so many tasks that are ripe for automation in the procurement world that will free up our teams for these more complex efforts. And I can say the excitement is not just at the executive or managerial level. Unsurprisingly, when we rolled the bots out to our users, they immediately saw the potential too. We've already had many contract specialists and contracting officers come to us with new possible use cases. The excitement around these technologies is contagious as we all start to see their potential. We can move to the next slide. As we look to future developments, we want to be able to call on some of the lessons learned from our experience developing our first 3 bots. And for me, there were 4 key takeaways. The first is how interrelated the business process is to the automation process. Just like a contracting officer isn't an expert in RPA, developers and program managers are likely not well versed in procurement, and certainly not in the associated agency-specific business processes involved. Looking back, time spent on the front end to clearly document and explain these business processes will pay dividends later in the project timeline. Secondly, it was important to understand what interrelated data systems will be involved with your RPA project, and more importantly, their capabilities and limitations. We ended up spending way more time than we should have trying to use our contract writing system to perform certain steps with one of our bots, only to find out that it was just adding in unnecessary complexity. Similarly, understanding your data sources and best development practices is incredibly important. Is there an API? How can you design the bot in a way that will be flexible for future system changes? Are existing data of sufficient quality to rely on them exclusively without human analysis and oversight? These are all of the questions that we'll be asking ourselves as we start our new bot projects. Next, we want to keep the user top of mind during all phases of development and rollout. The importance of user-centered design cannot be overstated. It doesn't matter how elegant or efficient the bot is if your user has trouble understanding or interacting with it. For future procurement bots at DOL, we intend to get the user base involved earlier to understand how they perform these tasks in the real world, manually. Engaging with users at all phases is important, but particularly during the requirements development and then later during rollout. We've seen the importance of keeping those lines of communication open after initial deployment. This technology is exciting and your users will be excited, but know that there's a learning curve. This is likely new for them. And the success of the project is predicated on navigating user challenges and securing their buy-in from day one. Lastly, and I can't stress this enough, get yourself a Krista. Krista was our project manager through the Centers of Excellence. Her efforts managing this project and our partnership with the Centers of Excellence were instrumental to the success we've had. By having a dedicated PM, someone to bridge that gap between business process owner and the developer, I know that we avoided unnecessary delays and project stalls. Without her or someone else in that role, our development would have been slower and our deployment less successful. So thank you, Krista.
Yeah,
I hope this gives you an idea about what motivated us to look at RPA to address some of the challenges at DOL, specifically in procurement, what one of our bots does, and some of the lessons learned that you might be able to use for your own projects. Thank you again for the opportunity to be with you, and I'll pass it back to you, Krista.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ryan. That was incredibly insightful. And I will say from my part, it's really been a pleasure working with the Department of Labor. And I agree with you. I think that the relationship that we've established here has really led to the success of the project. I particularly really like how dedicated you were to user-centered design and getting your users to the table immediately so that we were building something that was meaningful and valuable to them. So now I'd like to focus a little bit more on the technical build and what happened from the Department of Labor's Office of the Chief Information Officer. So we're going to play our recording from Lou Charlier, the Deputy CIO now. So we want to thank everyone so much for their presentation. I love that Get Yourself a Krista. We're working through a couple of technical difficulties. So give us just 1 second and we should be back in just a couple of seconds.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lou Charlier, the Department of Labor's Deputy Chief Information Officer. I want to thank GSA for inviting me to be a part of the TTS Impact Summit series. Today, I'm here to briefly touch on DOL's partnership with GSA's Center of Excellence and specifically our RPA program capability. A big focus for DOL the past few years has been IT modernization, which includes infrastructure upgrades, a migration to cloud-based services and applications, and a bolstered cybersecurity posture. In February, we partnered with GSA's Center of Excellence to launch our RPA program capability with a focus on automating repetitive tasks and procurement-based processes and IT needs. The partnership with GSA allowed us to combine expertise across DOL and GSA to formulate a successful path forward in using hyper-automation technology. We focused on identifying use cases to shift the workforce towards higher value work, resulting in cost savings, reduced risk, simplified workflows, and greater productivity to enhance our customer service for the public. So far, we've developed 3 bots that are in use at DOL. 2 of them are for our procurement office to help select eligible vendors and execute contract options in a timely fashion. And the 3rd is to research new products and services available via open source scans for IT solutions. Currently, we're working on scaling RPA DOL-wide to save more time, reduce risk, and increase compliance. You might ask, what were some of the steps DOL took to include this automation technology? First, we worked to understand the business need of our agencies, then began establishing a solid backbone infrastructure platform and IT governance process to support our RPA implementation. We also ensured that staff received training and conducted user acceptance testing to test our use cases so we can address the demand for RPA moving forward at DOL. Between the 3 use cases for procurement and IT, we're expecting to save approximately 3,500 hours a year on the time that was spent for selecting eligible vendors for government contracting and determining new products and services available. Also avoiding the time-consuming and costly process of renegotiating contracts by executing contract options in a timely fashion. Though our program is fairly new, standing up the RPA capability and bot development process did offer us some initial lessons learned and challenges to overcome. One of the most important is that organizations need to fully understand the business need for automating a process. RPA won't fix a broken process or make a non-valuable process valuable. You got to fix the process first and make sure you're choosing processes for RPA that add business value. Just as important as the RPA technology itself are the people who own the processes. You must involve the right stakeholders early and often to ensure the automation of the process is accurate. You also need to engage employees and stakeholders up front. There can be concerns among the staff that RPA will replace jobs. So it's important to reinforce that RPA can and should be used for automating mundane, repetitive tasks and freeing up the staff to focus on higher value mission work. And it's always a good idea to keep apprised of best practices, lessons learned, and be aware of the latest risks being discovered with technologies like RPA. Lastly, don't reinvent the wheel. RPA is a technology that greatly lends itself to reuse for an even quicker return on your investment. In summary, it's important to talk about the benefits of the technology and its return on the investment. RPA helps reduce repetitive administrative tasks, streamlines processes, increases accuracy, and helps ensure compliance with regulations and standards, provides an opportunity for professional growth, and can be integrated with existing IT assets and infrastructure. I hope this helps provide a little insight into DOL's RPA program capability and one that I am very excited about for the future. DOL's partnership with the GSA Centers of Excellence team was critical in making this a reality, and I am grateful for their guidance and support in making this a success. Thank you for your time.
All right, and with that, I would like to welcome Georgeta back to help us with some of the questions from the audience. Since Lou isn't here with us live, I'm going to do my best to help answer some of the technical questions that come in. And Ryan's going to be here to answer any of the questions related to the business challenge. So Georgeta.
Great. Thank you, Krista, Ryan, and Lou. We look forward to your questions. As a reminder, please type them in the chat box and we'll get to as many questions as we can. And we will go ahead as we're currently pulling questions from our audience. The first question is for Ryan. How did you identify the automations you wanted to go forward with?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and I think it's a critical consideration. As I mentioned, we looked for those processes that we thought could just be, that you don't need any critical human thought to pull, right? So going out and aggregating data from various sources, pulling down those screenshots, that sort of a thing. There's no critical human thought that's happening there. It's just a rote, repetitive task. And so trying to find those tasks in our organization that sort of fit that description, looking for that, I hate this term, but it's what's used in the PMA and the CAP goals, that low value work. Like I said, we have a highly trained workforce. Let's let them do the work that they're trained to do, and don't ask them to go out and pull screenshots and type in data to get outputs. So just trying to find those tasks that fit that model the best. That's how we arrived at those three.
Great, thank you. Krista, if there's anything else you want to compliment, if not, we'll go ahead with another question from our attendees. I think this is actually for you, Krista. Is this bot or any others available for other agencies? I know DHS PIL was working on something similar for lots of acronyms here, CPARS, and this would really help DHS.
Yeah, so I know Ryan and I had a lot of conversations around the different procurement resources that are available. And we actually did look at some of the CPARS data and what they're doing. And this actually came down to a technical question. And Ryan, I'm sure you have questions or answers for this from a procurement perspective. But one of the things was, how are we going to interact with these different procurement systems? And CPARS is actually a system where they're currently changing that system and changing the way that you're able to interface with the data. So we didn't include CPARS as part of the scope of this bot just because of the changing nature of how we were going to be able to interact with the data. Whereas the other sources, like Dun & Bradstreet, for example, had an API that we were able to interface with. And that made it much easier for the bot to pull in the data. Ryan, do you have any thoughts on this from a procurement perspective?
Well, no, I mean, absolutely. We would love to apply some of these technologies to things like CPARS, and hopefully we'll see an API in development down the road for this and other systems that we routinely access. It's definitely on the list of it's on our wish list for sure.
Great, thank you. And you spoke a little bit about keeping the user at the center of this work. With that, here's a good question. How did you train the end users to interact with the bots? And have you seen a lot of interest from them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we created user guides for each of the bots. So that's pretty standard. We recorded training videos. The rollout of these bots was less than ideal as far from a timing perspective. As you might know, procurement is incredibly busy at fiscal year end, August and September, and that's about the time that we were trying to roll these out. And so we found that pre-recording those video training sessions allowed our users to go in at their own leisure and review, get trained up with that. And then lastly, sort of right at rollout and then post rollout for a few weeks, we held sort of office hour sessions where we had folks come in who had now had an opportunity to use the bots, play around, try and break it, to meet with us in those office hour sessions to ask their questions specifically and individually. And I got to tell you, the interest has been incredible. They've been very engaged. I think they really see the value of these technologies. And what I've been sort of surprised by, maybe I shouldn't be, is how excited they are about future use cases and just their willingness to share those potential use cases for us as we look to expanding our use of RPA at the department.
Great, thank you. And we have time for just a final question here. And this could be for both or either. And Ryan, you were just talking about RPAs, which are often used as a workaround for integrating systems and databases. Do you see these bots as long-term or interim solutions?
Well, I think that's time will tell on that. I'd like to think that what we're building here is for the long term, and sort of building a interrelated network of of various tools for our procurement community. I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the next couple of years, to see how engaged our users are with it, whether we really do see resource savings with their implementation. So I'd like to think that they're long-term, but we'll certainly see what that looks like long-term.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that. I think that a lot of how you design your bot determines if this is an interim solution or a long-term solution. And so one of the things that I try to do wearing my technical hat is making sure that we're integrating with the different data sources in a more standardized way. So for example, where we could use APIs, use machine-to-machine connections rather than doing things like web scraping or grabbing screenshots, because a bot that interacts with a machine through something like an API or a database connection is a much more stable and much more sustainable relationship than just going to a website that may change frequently. And I actually think that that's tied to our earlier question about CPARs or other data sources, right? If we can come to a place where we're able to pass this data around in a machine communicable way, it will make these bots more sustainable because they're built on more stable technology rather than just grabbing screenshots or scraping. So I agree with Ryan. I think that when we design these bots in a smart way, which I think we have done, they can be more of a long-term solution.
Well, thank you so much to both, well, to not just both, but Krista, Lou, and Ryan, along with all of our fantastic speakers today. Now I'll hand it back over to Steve Babitch for our closing remarks.
Super. Thanks again, Georgeta, and thanks everyone. Thanks to all of you for attending, and a huge thanks to all our speakers and panelists. We hope you've taken away something new and interesting from our sessions today. And we certainly trust your coffee cups have learned something as well. Just a quick reflection on what we learned today. I think many can appreciate what Dan Morgan described in his keynote, the need to start to experiment with AI in smaller ways to de-risk it and get the agency increasingly comfortable with its application. And it's important to be mindful of explainability in the surrounding issues, but that you can in fact get started. Another thing I found interesting from Alka Patel was when she described the need to work on the operating systems that must be put in place to drive that broader cultural change, including ensuring that the full range of stakeholders are at the table for what should be a continuous responsible AI discussion, and that we need to reframe the conversation around responsible AI away from as an inhibitor and more to an enabler. For the VA work, this is just an incredible example of the power of what AI systems can deliver. The quantifiable results were amazing. A reduction of 3 to 5 days wait time and what that really means to a veteran. That really matters. And the reality of what they described was in fact a combined human plus machine team and effort that is doing the translation and triage of claims. And this matters additionally to the VA employees who still have their jobs, but that they can focus on more important aspects of their job. For example, actually spending time and helping veterans. And then again, and lastly, again, with the Department of Labor, another great example in how automation could have a dramatic improvement in the operations and efficiency of an acquisition process. And it's certainly applicable to a range of applications. So all that said, AI in government is a priority and focus area for us here at TTS. So we welcome you to engage with us further as we work alongside our agency partners to tackle the big challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. And while there are a number of AI efforts underway, it's still early. So our sense is that there's a lot more out there to be done. And maybe those efforts are well underway, and we clearly see that in some of these examples. Or maybe agency teams could benefit from some guidance and framing and defining the problems they're trying to solve, or perhaps help moving from pilot to scale, or even just getting your data and infrastructure AI ready. And I want to be clear about one thing. We're keenly interested in engaging the AI community in tangible ways, whether hosting events, hosting framing and scoping workshops, or in other ways, as long as it's helping you advance your mission. We've got, again, 1,000 folks in the AI community, some of whom are seriously experienced in AI, and others that are earlier in their journey. So please reach out if you think you've got a problem to solve, and we can help find the right folks who can help roll up their sleeves with you to solve that problem. If you have more questions or would like to connect further, please feel free to contact Rebecca McBride at tts-info@gsa.gov. And all of you in the AI community, you all have my email and Krista Kennard's as well. And please take a few minutes to complete our feedback survey. The link is being dropped in the chat as we speak, and will be sent out post-event as well. And we've also dropped a few links of interest in the chat too. So again, I'm Steve Babitch with the TTS AI portfolio, and thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.